Good evening. So I'd like to begin with a recognition that the University of Virginia is located on the land of the Monacan people. We give our honor and respect. We also acknowledge the enslaved laborers that built the grounds and architecture and have contributed to the spaces we occupy here today. Welcome to tonight's Miles H. Thaler Lecture by Chris Reed and Mike Belleme. Thank you to the Thalers for their generous support. Thank you to the exhibition team led by Kyle Sturgeon for their thoughtful work in the Elmaleh Gallery, Sneha Patel for her overarching vision, and to Dana Perlson for her coordination of this event. And thank you to Lena Cho, Assistant Professor in Landscape Architecture, and Scott Mitchell, Lecturer and PhD Candidate in Landscape Architecture, for moderating the discussion that will follow. Mike Belleme is a freelance photographer based in Asheville, North Carolina. His work ranges from long-form documentary projects to assignment-based editorial work, photojournalism, and portraiture. His practice involves photographing from a space of emotional availability and vulnerability and exploring themes involving connection and disconnection from that space. Mike has been recognized with multiple awards in multiple categories for his photography by Pictures of the Year International. And his clients are numerous. I have a long list here. I can maybe name people he hasn't worked for, but National Geographic, The Guardian, New York Times, Rolling Stone, among many, many others. Chris Reed is the founding director of Stoss Landscape Urbanism and is recognized internationally as a leading voice in the transformation of landscapes and cities. Chris is particularly interested in the relationship between ecology and landscape and infrastructure and social spaces and how they help form cities. He is currently professor in practice of landscape architecture, co-director of the Master of Landscape Architecture and Urban Design program, and coordinator of the Master of Design in Ecologies at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. With offices in Boston and Los Angeles, Stoss has pursued work that varies in scale, budget, and scope, and always delivered thoughtful, exploratory work that pushes the discipline to question itself and its role in a rapidly urbanizing world. Stoss's genesis is an array of formative projects, having tested the theoretical underpinnings of landscape urbanism and socio-ecological design discourse. 5 years ago, Chris Reed was here lecturing at the A School and presented this forming book project without a title at the time, but conceptually tying together the built work of Stoss and the photography of Mike Belleme, highlighting the individuals that bring landscapes to life. The book, Mise-en-Scene, is centered around 7 case studies of American cities: Los Angeles, Galveston, St. Louis, Green Bay, Ann Arbor, Detroit, and Boston. It intersperses photo essays by Mike Belleme with selected maps, drawings, and wireframe renderings of projects from Stoss, along with essays from guest contributors, quotes from contemporary and historical writings on the city, and interviews with residents. It's a pleasure to see this project come full circle, to have the exhibition here in the Elmaleh Gallery, and to engage Chris and Mike in a discussion about their collaboration. Please join me in welcoming tonight's Miles H. Thaler Lecture by Chris Reed and Mike Belleme.
Okay. Great, thanks. Nice to see everybody here tonight. Brad, thanks so much for the initial invite and the support of the work, for your friendship and collegiality for many, many years. It's really important in this profession that we have friends and colleagues that are constantly critiquing each other and pushing ourselves forward. Beth Meyer's another one. In fact, Beth was in on the very formative stage of this work many, many years ago. We were having coffee in Los Angeles, of all places, at an ASLA convention. And I said, I have an idea. I don't know what the idea is yet. And we just sat and chatted for a while. So I also appreciate that and the role that you've played for many years. Mike and I wanted to thank the department, Dean Hudson, for the invitation to come, for hosting us, and for supporting the exhibit. The A School's exhibition team, led by Assistant Dean Kyle Sturgeon, our own Olivia Poston, who's been helping on our side of the work as well, the generous support of the Miles H. Thaler Endowment, as well as the incredible help and hospitality of Dana, Sneha, and all the folks involved from the school. Scott Mitchell also had a very key role in the development of this book. Scott, for a very brief moment, worked at Stoss, and we started talking about what we could do here. And Scott was instrumental in beginning to research some photographers, actually made the first connection to Mike after I stumbled across him in the newspaper, and really was a great sounding board all the way through. And then William Shivers spent some time also in the office and was instrumental in actually that moment where we're trying to get it all together. So I really thank you all, and it's nice to see so many friends as well. I also want to make a shout out to Zoe from Brookline, who's here. Zoe's an undergraduate at UVA and is a good friend of the family and came. She's leaving early, not because she gets bored, but because she has a quiz at 6 o'clock, and we want to support that. All right, so Mike will join me in a minute and we'll go back and forth, and I look forward to the conversation that ensues. To begin, the tensions between societal, racial, and environmental advancement and retreat, the battle for the hearts and minds of people, the battle for the planet, continue to play out in so many of today's public discussions around urbanization, new development, impacts of climate change, planning and design strategies in cities, and open space. Mise-en-Scène is a project about the diverse and complex issues that shape and impact contemporary urban landscapes and cities, and, by extension, urban and landscape practices. It is a project about the lives and afterlives of cities and landscapes and the people who inhabit them, both the actors on stage and the urban, social, political, cultural, and environmental contexts in which they exist. It's a conversation about what we as designers encounter in our everyday work lives, and in many ways how we channel the diverse voices, lenses, perspectives, and currents to inform our work and to form the bigger project of city making. The project's very much a project of reflection and curation. Reflection in terms of taking stock of the moment, pre-pandemic and a bit during, asking what are the issues in play in contemporary cities? What is the state of urban and public affairs, environmentally, socially, culturally, urbanistically? What is common? What is unique to each of these places? And what are the currents we draw on, the acts and actors in progress? In this way, the lives and situations depicted in Mike's photographs here set the stage for the work we as designers do in cities, just as our designs and projects set up new or altered conditions that themselves prompt new responses, new actions, new dynamics, new scenes that continue to play out long after we leave. Second, it's a project of curation. In the same way that we are not single actors in the places we work, the book is an assemblage of lenses, voices, perspectives that are intended to paint a multivariate picture, to offer competing, complex, and contradictory standpoints, to stand along one another as an assemblage of things, and hopefully to reverberate creatively off one another. It's modeled a bit more on an art book as a collection or scrapbook of pieces that allow for multiple entry points and multiple readings, depending on where and when you start. It's one that asks questions and sets up prompts without attempting to tie a neat bow on the messiness and richness that is contemporary life. It's enriched and informed by 5 incredible collaborating writers that take on issues of the day: politics, climate, social activism, cities, racism, COVID, practice, as well as excerpts from literary and multidisciplinary writers, as well as members of the public that we encounter in our practice. One of my favorites is here by Tehu Cole, All the Cities Are One City, he writes. What is interesting to find in this continuity of cities, the less obvious differences of texture. And he concludes, what is everywhere, but is everywhere slightly different. As Brad said, the book is organized by 7 chapters, 7 American cities, taken west to east. They're set up in comparative ways, interspersed by occasional maps that speak to the scale and combination of landscape infrastructural and urban systems that constitute each city, as well as artifacts from the world of practice. The book extends from various lineages of photography. You can think of landscape photography and Ansel Adams, the work of Ed Bertinsky. More importantly for us and for Mike, I know, documentary photography, photojournalism, and the photography of the common American landscape. The image on the right by Frank Golke was part of an important exhibit called New Topographics, Photographs of a Man-Altered Landscape, 1975, about the time that J.B. Jackson released his work on the common American landscape. And it started to posit landscapes like this as worthy of looking at and worthy of critique and commentary through photography. We also brought forward works by folks like Juz Allen and Roy DeCarava, folks who were left out of exhibits like that. As important as that exhibit was, it was predominantly white men. And we wanted to also recognize in the course of the work some of the black and women photographers that contributed to a milieu of work around the same time. Within our own discipline, there's been an ongoing relationship between design, specifically landscape architecture, as well as social reform, activism, and photography. This is not new. Many of you know that as Olmsted was designing his park systems, this was a movement that grew out of social reform efforts of the time, in part motivated forward by the photography of Jacob Riis and Louis Wicks Hine, whose work you see here. Of course, we've all benefited from work by James Corner and Alex McLean, later work by Anu Mater and Dilip Dacunia, Alan Berger, and Kate Orff's collaboration with Robert Misrak. Also of note within this realm, I think, is the work that Michael Maltzahn and Uwan Bond did, where Uwan was looking at the street life of Los Angeles, and Michael was curating multiple voices to contribute to a conversation at a particular turning point in LA's history. Our book, of course, importantly, is one where Mike's eye is most evidently present. My voice and work are layered in both as framer and as one voice contributing to this general milieu. It's not aimed at an inside audience, and it's not a monograph. We thought it important to communicate with words and images that resonate with, or at least intrigue, a non-academic audience, one that extends far beyond the designers we usually talk to, in order to have a broader conversation. Now, I came across Mike's work one Sunday morning with this compelling image in the New York Times. And I started to look into it. This is from a series he did at Walmart parking lots in the South. As I began to explore, and as I shared this work with Scott, we got really excited about two projects in particular: Wild Roots on the right, in a beautiful and challenging landscape, project with nuance that captures the joys, grittiness, textures, and intimacies of living with others off-grid. And on the left, Stars and Bars for Al Jazeera, an unapologetic, non-politicized look at Confederate life in the Deep South for a Middle Eastern news outlet. These things were provocative. His eye was straightforward and real, and I thought this would be an interesting person to collaborate with over the course of what became 5 or 6 years in developing this work. I'll let Mike take it from here.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you all for being here. And I want to echo the gratitude that Chris shared for everyone who helped make this project come together. So strap in, I'm going to do a really whirlwind review of the last basically 15 years of my life leading up to this collaboration in about a minute and a half. So, but I do want to give a little bit of context of the type of work that I was doing before this collaboration and kind of a little bit about myself and who I am. So this first project that Chris mentioned is Wild Roots. It's a primitivist intentional community in the woods in western North Carolina. And the time I spent at Wild Roots had an enormous impact on my own life and development as a person up to this day. And it was a really significant turning point in my work as a photographer. I would say from this point forward, pretty much everything I did in some way kind of ties back to the idea and theme of connection. This project, The Kids of Hate and Love, focuses on basically a deep dive into the subculture of skateboarding. For the 10 or 12 years before I got into photography, skateboarding was pretty much my entire life. And as I got into photography, it felt like a really appropriate way for me to get started in photography, to kind of look back at this subculture that had shaped my life in so many ways, for better or for worse. Now, neither of these projects would ever really be considered landscape photography, but it's absolutely undeniable that in both cases, the landscape and the reaction to the landscape is very much shaping the way of life. This project I'm calling Sky People. It's currently still in progress. It explores the socioeconomic dynamics of the Caribbean cruise industry, but more specifically, it's kind of zooming out and looking at colonialism, capitalism, and the societal structures in place that create a sense of disconnection. So in that way, it's sort of the opposite of Wild Roots, but I actually kind of think of it as the same project, but approaching it from the opposite direction. This project largely uses metaphor to make contemporary images that engage with the past, and you'll see this technique kind of moving forward into the work that I do with Chris. Which brings us to this incredible opportunity that I had to work with Chris and the folks at Stoss. I mean, I can't really even put into words the impact that this project has had on me, and the gratitude that I have for Chris for involving me. And I learned so much throughout the process, but I would say the one thing that, if there's one thing that stuck out as the main thing that I learned, was that there's such a need for not just collaboration, because that's something that was already kind of missing in my work, but cross-disciplinary collaboration. I think so often we live within these bubbles of our professional world or even social, or just the ideas kind of circulate within bubbles that we have, and it can be very rigid. And I didn't realize how rigid my bubble was until I got the opportunity to work with Chris and work with someone who's thinking on a whole different level. And I truly believe that all the voices that came together to make this project kind of harmonize and bring such different perspectives and create something really unique. So the first part of the process of making this book was really just a lot of conversations. Chris and I, and Scott Mitchell and I as well, having phone conversations or walking around in person and talking. And I really just was trying to understand some of the philosophy and the ways of thinking that informed their work. And the more we talked, the more I realized that really everything is relevant. And you'll hear Chris talk about this. And that was really freeing to realize that anything in any of these cities that I was going to photograph was going to be relevant to the conversation. But there were certain themes that would come up again and again, and those would kind of give me touchstones and things specifically to look for. And one of those themes was the idea of reappropriation, or looking at how people improvise within spaces that are maybe not anticipated by whoever designed them. And that's something that Chris was excited about and looks for, and something that I was able to kind of find throughout the cities. And on the image on the right here, this is a park bench in a plaza at Harvard designed by Stoss. And I feel that you're really seeing how Stoss is anticipating those kinds of improvisations and designing specifically to prompt different types of use and thinking about different body types. And of course, with this idea of reappropriation, the first thing that came to my mind was skateboarding. I've already been reappropriating urban landscape spaces and infrastructure for half my life, but I'd never had those terms to think about it. So that was a really good opportunity for me to think about the things that were of interest to Chris, and then find the ways that my own interests overlap with that. And again, like I said with the Sky People project, time is a really important facet to to this work, and it's a specific challenge to photography because as photographers we're working within a two-dimensional medium, and the world is not a two-dimensional place, and Stoss is absolutely not a two-dimensional practice. In fact, it's very much a four-dimensional practice. If you look at the work they're doing in Boston and Galveston, they're really thinking 80 to 100 years into the future, looking at climate change and sea level rise. And the Brickline project in St. Louis is engaging with hundreds of years of the history. So the question for me is how to address these questions of how people and ecologies are adapting to these changing landscapes. And with an issue like at the scale of climate change or sea level rise, how do you make images that allude to this unknown future without being able to talk to it directly? Now, I'm an outsider in pretty much every possible way you could imagine while I'm making this work. Obviously, I had no previous even introduction into the world of landscape architecture, and I honestly spend very little time in cities, and in particular, none of these cities I had spent very much time at all in, and even, getting more specific to the neighborhoods that I was spending time in were completely foreign to me. So it was really important for me to be cognizant of being an outsider, and it's been done so many wrong ways throughout history, and I really wanted to think about how I was approaching these spaces as an outsider. And there's so much to be said about that, and I think we're going to get more into that in the conversation afterwards, but I want to just talk a little bit now about my philosophy and how I enter these spaces. So first would be just the idea of immersion. I try to be as entirely present as I possibly can be and just feel what there is to feel. Any walls that I may have up need to come down. I need to move through these spaces with absolute vulnerability and openness. And I believe that is the space from which connection can happen. And that's really, for me, the current that I'm trying to tap into is connection. And I want to be the best possible conduit for that current. So the closer I can get to it and the more I can feel connected, the more that current can pass through me and I can pass it on to you as a viewer. But I think probably the most important piece to being an outsider is humility. And I think this is equally true whether you're a photographer or a designer. I think it's super important to understand the difference between data and factual information versus lived experience and perceived realities that exist within communities. It really doesn't matter if you've taken a class or read a book. The most important thing we can do is just listen. But the part for me that's really fun and joyful about working as an outsider is that when I'm in a new space, I can truly be guided by a genuine sense of curiosity and wonder. But it's important for me to not quite satisfy the viewer's curiosity because I want them to feel the same curiosity that I felt. So this image is a good example that's so full of tension because at the core of this image is a central question of what's going to happen next. You have the bird creeping in at the exact moment that the fisherman's about to get the fish off the hook, and we don't know if he's going to throw the fish to the bird, is he going to throw it back into the ocean, or is he going to put it in a cooler and take it home? And I promise you the question is a lot more interesting than the answer. By far, the most difficult part of the process of making this book was the sequencing. It was all fun and games running around all these cities, making thousands and thousands of images. But when it came time to try to organize that into something cohesive that had something to say, that was a very daunting task. So I wanted to run you through a sequence as it exists in the book. This is the first chapter, which is Los Angeles. And this is going to be basically me telling you my interpretation of these few pages. If Chris was to walk through these same exact pages with you, it could be a very different interpretation, and anyone else who's read the book may have a totally different view on this. So I'm not telling you the right answer. I'm only telling you kind of my view of what these pages are about. So starting with this page, this spread, we're moving into this one, and immediately you'll recognize kind of a circle motif connecting that spread in this one. And that's just a tool that we use in editing to indicate to the viewer that has something to do with this and that we should be seeing these as a continuity. And then you'll see a block of text here. And the text is actually referring directly to the previous image, and it's important to us to leave the previous image without this text so you can interpret that in whatever way you want. But then also to put it here in the following spread where it also relates to the images you're seeing here. So I'll read that for you. It says, LA is the land of constructs. While many real struggles exist within this complex city, just as many are fabricated by a society obsessed with perfection. The image of the sculpted round tree in the modest front yard speaks to the futility of this pursuit for most. The white picket fence, the universal symbol of middle-class assimilation, paint chipping from its surface. Shoots of new growth rebelliously defy the tended perfection of the manicured tree, control and chaos in a constant struggle, all reflecting our own self-worth and social standing for all the world to see. So I think in particular that control and chaos idea is sort of the thread that we continue with and move through the next several spreads. So you're seeing that play out again here, and you're also, I think throughout these next few images, you'll see the human-non-human relationship within designed spaces. And on the image on the right, I was just kind of interested in the relationship between the barbed wire and the cactus and how they're both using a similar strategy for defense. Then we move into a drawing that I'm sure anyone here could tell me more about than I could tell you about. But this is actually the same scene as the left image in the previous spread, which is the Venice Beach High School. And again, you're seeing the continuation of the circles, which is kind of continuing the visual theme moving through. And then we move into this thread. And again, this is still all very relevant to the thing that I wrote about the tree. I think you're seeing the exact same dynamic playing out here as what I was talking about in the tree. And it's just so interesting to me to start to learn the language and the ways to think about the landscape in a way that I feel like I'm so psychoanalyzing the human landscape and looking for the tensions that exist at the edges where the wilderness start to creep back in. And then lastly, this is sort of the same dichotomy but in reverse. Or the same duality, but in reverse, where on the left you're seeing the most wild and natural image that you're going to see in the entire LA chapter, and it's really just a celebration of the absolutely beautiful plant life that exists in this arid climate. And on the right, you're seeing what immediately is this gorgeous picture of wildlife and plant life. But then if you look a little closer, this tension starts to emerge as you see the trash along the hillside. And in the background, you're seeing hints at this enormity of infrastructure that it takes for a city like LA to work. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Chris.
So we were quite deliberate about how we set the book up to allow each of you your own starting points and to construct your own pathway through. As Mike has shown you, there are many ways to begin that journey. I'm going to very quickly give you a couple other through lines to the book as well. First, around sociability and human behavior. Mike talked about this relative to appropriation, particularly the skateboarder project. Here's an interest in the unself-conscious ways in which we encounter the world, and then perhaps reappropriate it for our own desires. Kids are especially good at this. They improvise, they respond to things around them as they are, and then they appropriate them. As we grow up, we continue to do so, but maybe a little bit less. But it's one of the things that's always fascinated me about humans and human behavior, and the way in which we think about that as we design opportunities for those moments into the work. In many ways, Mike's showing you the normalcies of everyday life, the joys and tensions that come in cities, and how they play out in the public realm. These are people just doing the things they do, sometimes in very unexpected places. In many ways, we adapt to the conditions around us, put them to unintended use to suit our own purposes. This is what's happening in the image on the right in Herman Hertzberger's photos. It's also what's happening in Jules Verne's photo to the left, though I will say it's a result of sheer neglect and disinvestment there. It's not a choice. but generally the interest in choice, diversity, flexibility, and adaptability of designed elements and spaces and of the people who will come to inhabit them are critical informants for a place to be conducive to richly changing social and collective uses. In Green Bay, our goal, and in many projects our goal, is to connect to and further prompt the everyday and the mundane on the one hand, and the celebratory and the collective on the other, while also leaving room for the unanticipated, the unexpected, things we can't imagine, but others can, and those that are simply beyond our control. Second, the intermingling of urbanization and environmental processes. This is my hometown in New Bedford, where city life, urban infrastructure, social networks, and ecological dynamics are together starting points for our work and for what we try to instigate, initiate, or interact with as we design and program public spaces and projects. These issues manifest in very different ways, in different places. Here you're seeing Galveston. The impact and implication of landscape, powerful and persistent in the heart of cities and as a shaper of city life at a wide range of scales from the individual person to the larger ecosystem. Here's where I see landscape in the lives of cities converging. In Galveston, a very noticeable set of economic and social and urban and biological dissonances. At some moments, a sense of impending doom, a confluence of risk and cost. This is a town that's been blown off the map multiple times and is quite vulnerable moving forward. All this amidst people tending to day-to-day matters and carefree vacationers. Here are a set of rich and varied and complex, even troublesome starting points, and how they might inform ways we might imagine new futures around need to adapt, open to the inputs and priorities of those already in place. In Los Angeles, a different context entirely, socially, politically, environmentally. Here, heat, fire, drought, loss of biodiversity are front and center. This is a city of infrastructure, a city of consumption. And yet, within this space, Mike reminds us that LA offers something else, the detailed and the discrete, an accumulation of beautiful, textured, and even tender moments. Opportunities for quiet and personal connection amidst the swirl and energy and scale of things beyond. How do we create space for these moments in our work and in the complexities of the city? And finally, questions of identity, race, and social justice. Who we make cities for and who has been excluded. A struggle for the full rights of all people as equal citizens with just and equitable access to life and all that it offers. Sometimes these are issues that are not that far out of view, but may require a strategic turn of perspective or a somewhat deeper dive into parallel worlds, parallel cities that have been constructed specifically for whites and blacks. You're looking at two images of St. Louis, investment in white neighborhoods on the left, disinvestment in black neighborhoods on the right. And yet, through all of this, you see the spirit and persistence of people sharing time, sharing food and laughter, sharing each other. All this raises questions. Whose spaces are these? For whom were they made? Who was erased in their making? Who is not welcome here? In the words of Dean Nichols, how do we cross lines? How do we disrupt the physical, political, social, economic, and racial lines that have been drawn? Who do we design for? In Detroit, a city of hope, a city of resurgence, a place where people are starting to find common ground. Here you have new and emerging landscapes in a public realm built around social common denominators, D. Nichols' words. Food, music, landscape, social interaction, art, and most importantly, opportunities for joy. It builds on work people are doing here to transform the city and the landscapes around them, and to cultivating the land. Here people are imagining new futures, grounded on new social conditions, with new rights to the city, new ways to collectively occupy space and animate urban landscapes, and the work they're doing to rebuild relationships between and among each other, still with much work to do. Just to wrap here, the stages on which we work, the actors we engage with, are already in motion when we arrive. Our work as designers begins many acts in. Our appearances are sometimes relatively short. You might think of our work as understanding the scripts and dialogues as they are playing themselves out, interacting with those on stage and the forces behind the scenes in ways that both respond to and shift what is at work, resetting the trajectory of the play in ways that sometimes reveals what is hidden just beneath the surface, and giving new voice to those who have been off stage. In so many ways, the project tries to communicate the hopes and dreams, the struggles and challenges of contemporary life in American cities and urban landscapes to all who will look and listen closely, perhaps even to resituate our starting points as designers. With that, I'll thank you, and we'll open it to conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris and Mike, for this introduction to the book. In terms of the format, I think we have about 20 minutes or 25 minutes or so, and of course we'll open it up for a few questions at the end. But I think you have superpowers in terms of being able to see what kind of questions we might be asking. Because you answered the first question more so, but we want to get into some of the things a little bit deeper. And the first question that Scott and I had when we were talking about the book and kind of preparing for this discussion was really about the book itself. You know, Chris, you mentioned in your introduction, but also in your book, the book is really a scrapbook, a collection of artifacts, documents that are not necessarily intended to create a logical narrative, but to offer multiple readings, multiple musings, and features on city life. And you also talked about how embracing the messiness of life is really important and that, in a way, guided this book in terms of the curation and so on. So, you know, from that point of view, you know, the question that we want to pose to you, in a way, is that, you know, why that approach now? And also, for you, Mike, as well, kind of the other pairing of that, the question might be, and you also mentioned how in your work you focus more on the rural landscape. So why urban in this book?
Let's start with this. Why this and why now? I mean, so much of our work engages multiple publics, multiple voices by necessity. We started the practice working in the public realm, focusing on cities, focusing on people. This is different than others who have started from a horticultural background who are primarily interested in gardens. My starting point was cities, and the role that landscape can play and the impact that landscapes can have on people. And that tie to social reform that I referred to in the late 19th century, I think, was really important. It's part of how my own thinking around cities and landscape was formulated. And it's just simply part of how we work. And we do it in a way that's quite open. When I was listening to Mike talk about coming to the project and to our projects with humility, with openness, it's exactly the way we need to do that. We can't possibly assume that we know what people know, and the ways in which that they can begin to construe stories and talk about their backgrounds and their needs and their desires is something that can inform the work in incredibly deep and rich ways. We're also at a moment in time, I think, socially and culturally, where we have to do that, in part to make up for wrongs of the past, but frankly to just build a diversity of energy that can be brought into the work and make for some exciting places that are really interesting and inclusive to more people.
For me, this project lived in a really unique space that I've never really worked within. That is, initially it was, it felt very much like a collaboration, but it was initially a commission. So I was hired to come in and make work kind of based on a lot of these ideas that I was learning about from Chris and from Scott. So in that way, the question is not why cities, but why me? And I was extremely confused in the beginning, to be honest. And I've told this story a few times in talks, and actually I tell it as if it was the first conversation between Chris and I, but in reality is between Scott and I. And when Scott initially reached out and started to talk about the project, I kind of thought they were looking for more of like a portfolio of design projects, and I had no idea who these people were, and the incredible amount of experience and knowledge they have, not just about, of course, the work they do, but photography as well. So in my naivete, I responded with a simple email of, I think there's this photographers that specifically work in landscape and landscape architecture, and that's not really what I do, but I'm honored and thanks for reaching out. And Scott wrote back and said, of course we are aware that there's people that work in this field, but we like the work that you do and think that you can bring something unique to it. And it was very much the fact that I was an outsider that they were interested in, and specifically they were not looking for that polished image of the kind of portfolio pieces. They very much encouraged me, even though my work is already a little bit raw and loose. Scott, in our first conversations, was really pushing me to get even more loose with it, and said just really we're looking for some messiness, and we're looking for this sense of grit and life in the city as it really is. So after some time, I started to kind of see how I fit into the project, and that's when it really started to feel like a collaboration and not a commission. And yeah, we were able to really kind of get on the same page, and our voices started to come together, and through this back and forth of making work, looking at it, talking about it, making more work, looking at it, talking about it, and moving forward.
That's interesting. Thank you. That's interesting, the way you talk about it, because in many ways it's a departure from your previous work in the type, and also from your earlier book, Chris, too, right? In terms of emphasize in a different emphasis that you bring. So, I mean, I guess the question for you too, as a follow-up, Mike, is why did you end up choosing Chris? Why did you choose to work with him? Was it, kind of a challenge, or the different types of environment that you're after, or was it really the kind of collaboration that you were seeking? Just wanted to hear more about that as well.
Yeah, me too.
Well, it wasn't a bad deal. No, I mean, really, in my line of work, which is mostly, I do, as I showed my personal work, but mostly I work on a commission basis, and it's usually done at a very fast pace. Even, working for publications like the New York Times, which I do, work regularly, and others, it's usually a day or two that I get to work on something, and it feels like a pretty direct ask, like, go shoot this. And I do have a sense of my own voice and my own approach doing it, but also things get filtered through publication, the other people involved, the photo editors, and a lot of your intention can get lost. So the thing that was most seductive to me about this collaboration was the freedom that it allowed me.
And you mentioned that in the acknowledgement section too.
Yeah, I mean, I actually had a lot of fun kind of poking at the edge of what this project is. I kept on expecting to be reined in. You know, I spent 2 hours at one point trying to get the perfect portrait of a llama, which you can find in the book because it is in the book, and there was no point. I spent also a couple hours in Galveston at a swimsuit competition in a hotel, and you know, I'm expecting at some point for Chris to just be like, what the hell does this have to do with anything, you know? But that moment never happened, and I felt like I was able to just be giddy with creative control, and that's all an artist ever really wants, is to be able to explore freely, and to also, you know, not to be crass, but to be paid fairly, and also have that creative control. Those two things rarely overlap.
To that end, I think there's, I mean, it's been demonstrated that there is a subtle idea or kind of undercurrent to your personal work, and clearly a development of an idea about landscape and urban landscape here. You say that you weren't often in cities, and your personal work doesn't reflect a kind of pre-existing idea of what an urban landscape is, and yet maybe you could talk a little bit about what that process of learning to see and narrate and describe. You had kind of a walkthrough of the few spreads, and then for Chris, maybe talk about how you learn to see and narrate and work with an outsider, not just an outsider to the landscape architectural profession, but also an outsider to the cities. Most of the photographers that Stoss had used before were locals. They were local people in Green Bay or Ann Arbor or LA. And so what was the kind of learning process for you to understand how he was seeing, or to understand how Stoss's work was affecting the cities where you were working?
I'll jump in because I think mine's pretty brief. It really had so much to do with those first conversations. Those really framed it for me, and especially actually walking and talking with each of you in the cities and getting to start to see these currents that exist within the landscape that were completely lost on me. And I'm very familiar with, you know, my experience of the urban landscape is mostly through skateboarding. So, you know, I'm very used to looking at the landscape and immediately knowing how many stairs that is and the angle of the rail and all these kind of things that I'm very tuned into right away. But this was a kind of a new filter through which to look at the world. And as a photographer, that's something you get really excited about. And, you know, there was a lot of precedent looking back. The New Topographics body of work exhibition that Chris mentioned back in 1975 sort of set a whole direction of a certain genre of photography, which was that looking at landscapes, and often urban landscapes, in this kind of what I call psychoanalyzing kind of way, where you're looking at the details in a landscape that give you an indication of the society that created that, or the human psychology that resulted in this particular shape of thing or arrangement of things.
It was interesting when we would sit down to start to talk about a city. I'd share with Mike some of what was already going on in the practice, what we were already doing in those places. And I'd often say, well, you know, I want you to look at this and go here and look at that and all that. But really, whatever you want to do is just fine. And so he'd sort of go on that trail, but then wander and meet some people and see some things. And he'd bring back these photographs. Some of the work was still in progress at the time. Some of the work, you know, was in places where it was done. For the work, for the cities where the work was in progress, it was incredibly interesting and helpful to see Mike's eye looking at cities that were so familiar to me, particularly like Boston. Some of what he captured in Boston, the dual images of the painted girl's face fading away and that tree was an aspect of Boston that's there, but I didn't know. I know where it was now. But it offered a richness and a dimension to a city that I knew, that I didn't know before. And frankly, I think a lot of people in the city of Boston would associate that image with him. The guy with the steaming coffee cup, and the choir getting out of Sunday church, also in that same neighborhood of East Boston, was in many ways portraying the true richness of a place that goes far beyond what people think they know about a place. In Los Angeles, these moments of intimacy that he found within a place that is just so big and so active, in many ways we're there because we're quite interested in the energy, the infrastructure, the toughness, and yet might continue to find these moments of sheer tenderness, right? The very human aspect of how people are living within that place, right? And also to look the cactus and the barbed wire, right? This very unique beauty that a place like Los Angeles has. All these things were starting to come out of the work in ways. Some of it amplified things that we had talked about. Some of it was just a refreshing new view. And I can't tell you directly how that informs one thing or another in the work, but I know that it resonates and is on our mind.
So does this mean that we all need a photographer
Yeah, sure.
to come around with? I mean,
I'm available.
I mean, I imagine that this must change the way that you approach, as you talk about the kind of coming into a scene already through several acts, already with actors and a script that you're merely kind of interpreting, understanding. This very idea of mise-en-scène as something that you enter into momentarily, how without the benefit of a 4 or 5 year project with a renowned photographer, do we as landscape architects then begin to re-engage with these communities in these places?
Yeah, I think you look and you look carefully. You record through whatever means you have to record. You go back and back and back again and see it at times of day and in seasons where you might not normally do it. You pair that with what we as designers know as site analysis, right? I mean, so much of my interest in landscape was about the functioning of landscape, the hydrologic processes at work, the ecological processes at work, even though many of them had been denuded or shut down in some ways. I was always interested in what makes a landscape work, right? And this extends that to the social and the human as well. And just taking on the design of very specific things like a bench that much better responds to the way we all behave. I mean, if you look at us, we're all sitting in these chairs quite differently, right? We're conforming our bodies to them, right? So are you all. But the idea that we can design for that difference rather than do something that's self-same, I think, again, becomes a starting point. So how is it that we tap into that? How is it that we set up new futures by prompting things, but not limiting? Knowing that how people interact, how other forces and processes interact with the work is as rich as whatever it is that we physically install at that moment.
There's one thing I wanted to jump back in and say, and this kind of is maybe backtracking a little bit to the earlier questions, but it's something that I think a lot of people would not know about the book, and I think is an interesting thing to know as far as your reading of the book, which is that like in the first about half of the book, you're not seeing any finished design work by Stoss, and some of the chapters later focus really heavily on finished projects. But what you wouldn't know is that most of the places I photographed in those other chapters that don't feature heavily the designed work, those are still Stoss sites. They're just places where the work has not been implemented yet. And in fact, the entire St. Louis chapter, every single image in that chapter, which is one of the biggest chapters, is all shot along the future Brickline Greenway. So they're all existing conditions of Stoss sites. So although it may kind of initially read as these projects within the context of the city, but it's actually a little bit more direct in that we're actually seeing the places where they're currently doing work, and what the circumstances that they're reacting to currently in this very moment as they're doing the design work.
Scott also kind of alluded to this kind of next set of questions that we have, but it's really about the stage too, right? The stage that you work at, Chris described as there is kind of unevenness, to the stage, never a neutral thing. There's social life and differences in the social life in who we designed for, who's portrayed, who has the voice in the stage, and so on. So, and then also, in a way, the book, through your photographs too, Scott the other day pointed out to me that in one of the photos, you are in that photo, in the photograph. So, in the way the book is positioning the complicatedness of the stage, right? That we as city dwellers, we participate in. We also shape them as designers. We learn from them. We are observers, but also we are active shapers and creators. So, I wanted to, in a way, hear from both of you what this kind of how you are understanding this idea of stage, and also going back to what Chris you were mentioning earlier about how you're kind of pairing this work with site analysis and so on in terms of the work that you do. How would this approach to the stage, and the book is in a way embracing. If we were to embrace this approach, how should we as designers, in a way, think about the existing site conditions differently? What this might challenge, the collaboration that you're doing, together, but also the way we traditionally do the site analysis and the existing conditions kind of work, and what might be missing in the way that we're approaching the existing, and how can we begin to capture more of that kind of fuller aspects of what the site engages with.
Yeah, I think your observation that we have a role in that we, in fact, construct that stage as much as the stage is already there for us, right? Puts a whole lot of responsibility on us, but also offers us opportunity to take that chance in some really interesting ways. We're constantly looking for things that are hidden or buried, right? Again, I usually start with environmental processes, but we're also quite interested in the history of a place and what may have been there before the thing that we're looking at in real life. How is it that we allow those layers of history and occupation to resonate, and then spend time thinking about who the people were that were inhabiting the place, and now, frankly, what also was inhabiting that place? How can all of that begin to contribute to a much richer mix of characters and places that we draw on? I think these days we have that responsibility to find those buried histories, to not only recognize voices that have not previously been invited to the table, but to make space for those voices on the timeline and in the ways that are most appropriate to them, to bring that all forward so that the stage we are constructing is one that's really quite rich and diverse.
The concept and title of Mise-en-Scène, or Mise-en-Scène. I'm still learning how to pronounce the title of our book, of all the languages you could have chosen to put the title of the book. The concept is obviously meant to speak to the practice of design and how design sets the stage for what's to come. But it's also very relevant to the practice of photography. That's exactly what I'm doing with the camera. I'm looking out at the world, and the world is a stage, and I'm trying to arrange the things within the stage in a way that I can make sense of. The world's a really complicated place, visually, and just in terms of the nature of reality. So I think using the camera as or my mind and the camera as a way of setting the stage was an interesting process for me to, I think any photographer, to just make sense of the world around us and to embrace that complexity while also trying to simplify it and distill it down to a way that can be clearly communicated.
Do we have time for a few questions?
Yeah. Any questions? Beth?
First, this has been really it's an amazing pleasure. And I've been reminded of a conversation that Mise-Rock and Orff had here when the Festival of the Photograph, which was here for about 5 years. There are a lot of National Geographic photographers who actually live outside of Charlottesville, and they had this incredible festival. When Richard was talking about his relationship with Kate in the book, it was really amazing to hear him talk about this crazy person who wanted to do a collaboration, but then who also wanted to cut up his photographs and think about them within the context of her collages and site diagrams. So I'm wondering if you two have a contract for the next phase of the work. And I guess, Chris, have you ever thought about the photographs as something that you would act on? And Mike, get another contract before he starts talking about that. Have you ever thought about the limits? Maybe you've already talked about it contractually. These are my photos, no photoshopping, no cutting and pasting. And before answering, I just want to share one more insight about a designer in photography. Right before Enrique Morales died, and he was lecturing here, he talked about how he would take photographs of his last built landscape or building and cut them up and create new montages, which created the formal language of his next projects. It was a form of reflection, just like this book was. So I'm not asking the question like facetious, like I'm really seriously interested in the life of these photos in your creative process and your legacy and how you talked about them.
Appreciate the question. It always terrifies me when Beth is the first one to ask me. I think not to the extent or in the way maybe that you suggest. We did draw a couple things on them very hesitantly. You saw one, and we were very careful to show them to Mike. And we only got one in the book, I think. But we were also very deliberate for this project. I think the one of the seawall in Galveston with the lines on it were helpful in the introduction to put a point on what we were trying to do and to create the relationship that maybe people weren't seeing. The pairing I showed too with the kids playing on the benches at Harvard in the snow with the drawing of the bench was one where we didn't have to mess with his photograph his pairing of the Harvard bench with the mattress under the bleacher, like, you know, those things come when you're just sitting through the editing process, right? So I've got to say there were one or two others we drew and we didn't, I don't even know if we showed them to you, but we didn't like them. We thought they were messing with something. The way that that I've used the general body of work, and you should see the body of work that's not represented. Mike went to Milwaukee and has a whole chapter that didn't make the cut of the book. I went to a water symposium and only presented photographs of water from various places, whether it's the splash of a car in the puddle or various effects of the sea underneath the pier in Santa Monica. There's so many ways I can use the volume of work that Mike produced, and in many ways, for me, take on a topic and see something in the work that I hadn't seen before. So in that way, the work continues to live on. I don't know what's next for me or for us in this, but...
Yeah, I don't know either, but I would like to say that I think, like, I talked about this process being a really learning process, and I would say so much of that actually was at the very, very end, and in some cases not until I held that book in my hand, when I really understood what was happening. And part of that's where I talk about cross-disciplinary collaboration, and I think a lot of my own rigidity that I was holding on to throughout this whole process was the kind of the art documentary photography world kind of having too loud of a voice in my head, and that's a lot of where I was fighting throughout this process of making this book. Through the design process, I really don't think the designers liked me very much because I really didn't want the images to be used as design elements. I wanted them to kind of hold the integrity of the image and be presented really simply. But I've had a shift with that, and I think it's through this collaboration that I'm actually a lot less precious now about this idea that it needs to be presented in a really particular way. I love the idea now of them being utilized and having a different life beyond this, no matter what it is. You know, I don't think I would not be hesitant to whatever the case may be, and I think I'm losing that sense of needing to hold on to the integrity of my own intention behind the images. I'd love to see what other life they could have and how they could be used in any number of ways. So, yeah, you were like looking at me like, you know, like I was going to react really strongly against the idea of the images being used in that way. And I do think that I kind of, during the earlier phases of the process, was sort of pushing back against that. But yeah, I'm having a shift with that.
Even if it involves cutting up?
Yeah, absolutely. Cut them
Well,
out all you want.
I appreciate that prompt, though. For me, I'm not sure I'd do it with this project or these images. I think we would deliberately engage on a different kind of project where from the starting point, it might change the way that Mike's working. It might change the way that we're starting to look at these images, right? For me, this was just capturing a moment and was kind of reflective in a lot of ways. And that, what you're suggesting, is what I've been brewing on in my head. Like, what is that next projective project?
I also really miss the Look 3 festival. I was at that Mise-en-Scène talk, and I came every year, and it was just such a... That's my history with Charlottesville, pretty much, is coming to that festival every year. It's amazing.
Any other? Yeah, Sam.
Thank you so much for this. I think Scott knows me pretty well, that we like to talk about photography from time to time. And the current marching call in our studio is, how are we making the invisible visible? And it's kind of like how we're asked to interrogate the drawings and work that we're doing. And I'm curious about how photography figures into that kind of process. You know, does it kind of aid in making the invisible visible? Like, does it kind of like help capture like the ephemerality that like maybe doesn't show up in like GIS or kind of like other modes of looking at places, but also like does it enforce that divide between like what's invisible and visible, and like does it actually like strengthen that sort of like division in what's able to be seen and like what's not getting picked up in the grain. And I just wonder how that maybe is factoring into some of the work that you're doing in the studio, and how this process has kind of like influenced the way that you see and value the things that are there.
My experience of photography is so directly tied to just my own experience of moving through the world. So how it exists in these contexts of how it's seen and relates to those kind of structures and stuff, that's not something that's on my mind until much later. But in terms of making work, I do think it informs where I go and where I look in terms of visible versus invisible. I'm always, if I'm ever influenced by work, other people's work, as kind of research going into what I'm doing, it's mostly just so I can know what to avoid and have a sense for, like, this is how this has already been talked about, this is what's been seen. And so in that sense, that's how I'm looking for the invisible, is what hasn't, I mean, in my 10 days or so in one of these cities, what can I do that's going to actually contribute to a conversation that has already been ongoing for generations before me? So, and I don't know if I accomplish that or not, but it's certainly my goal to, and how I tend to guide the way that I move through spaces is kind of looking for something that has some sense of striking a chord of familiarity in a very human sense, but not having the familiarity in the sense of, oh, I've seen that before.
I mean, there are so many ways to get at that question, right? I'll keep to photography. One of the things that was part of the process of the book, and is something that I've tried to carry forward in the office, was not only do you go out to places you're familiar with, you then go out to places that you're not familiar with, and then you talk to people who are not from your own background and ask them where you should go as well, right? So you start to unearth parts of the city, you start to see people maybe that wouldn't have been on your original itinerary, right? I think that's one way. We talked about analysis before and various other ways to do that. But I think there's something also in the constructing of the story that you then tell as the starting point for your work, right? It's not neutral, it's not mute. As Mike said, he took thousands of photographs in each of these places, right? He had to edit them, then we edited them together, then we had an editor edit them with us, and then we still edited them down, right? Just to kind of, not to get a single narrative, but to get the right set of things working within each chapter. And I think for us, that's really important in the work. That's a technique that we're bringing forward. How is it that we can start to construct a story of the seen and the unseen through a very curated collection of images, starting points, prompts, right, that could somehow inform the work? And I think there are just many ways that you can begin to get at that question, but I think it's been a valuable process for us.
If I can have a follow-up to this portion. We talked about the invisible portion of the work, right? The one thing that I've been curious about looking at your photographs in the book too is, what do you do in the scene at the moment to capture, the image, the face, right? The mood of the scene and the people, right? And oftentimes we also, as designers, are outsiders to the particular community they're working with and so on. Could you share a little bit more about the things that we might not see in the photographs that you do to get to that point in the photographs?
There's such a variety of different types of approaches to trying to capture kind of a genuine sense of humanity and emotion in a moving scene. The one that I use most often is to start with conversation, introduce myself to someone, talk to them, really get a sense for who someone is, and maybe start with a few portraits, and then let someone kind of get back to whatever they were doing. Maybe when I walked up and try to, over time, and it's a slow process. There's no shortcuts. Kind of start to disappear back into the background. But it's a really complex thing. I mean, everyone talks about aiming to be the fly on the wall, but I think honestly we're more the elephant in the room. And sometimes I like to address my presence in the scene and actually have, you know, an image where someone is reacting to me in some way, and not try to hide from that, because I think photographers like to pretend that, you know, we can disappear, but we're so informing what's happening in front of us, and that never goes away unless you're really working on a very long-term project with someone who really can feel that degree of comfort with you. But making work like this, that never happens. The other way that it can happen is to be extremely fast, you know, and actually catch a moment before the person even realizes you're there. And then still in that case, I like to have a conversation afterwards and say, you know, hey, I just took your picture, blah, 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 and make sure that people are kind of comfortable with it. But sometimes there's a moment happening, as soon as you try to talk to them, that moment's gone. And so there are definitely moments where I try to just always have my camera settings ready for, even if I walk into a different space with different lighting, I go ahead and change my settings to be right for the circumstances, so I can react very quickly. I think probably one of my very favorite photographs in the entire book is this one that's on the, well, no, it's not up there, on the back cover. And this one we printed huge in the exhibition upstairs. And this was a moment that happened in a fraction of a second. I was walking one way, they were walking the other way. I saw this kind of interaction and moment happening. I lifted the camera as I was walking one way, took one frame, and passed by. Didn't really understand what I had in the picture until later. I just knew there was a moment happening. But now, you know, and in some cases that's luck, you know, and looking at that image now, and the expression of the woman in the front is so relatable, where she's rolling her eyes, you know, at her friend. You can tell she's like acting annoyed by her friends dancing in the background, but also there's so much love in that picture, and I think it just really captures something relatable. So yeah, either really fast or really slow is the answer.
That may not really transition well into the design all the time, right? Because faster part especially, but any other questions from the audience? I'll go with there and then to you after.
Just an easy, quick one is, why did you choose black and white over color images?
There's too much color in the work we do as designers. Everybody relies on color. This is in illustrative drawing. I just wanted to take that away and not have it be about green and lustrous blues. I wanted to kind of simplify the tone. And I had seen some of his work in black and white and really wanted to kind of insist on that piece. Let's just look at what's in the photograph. Let's look at the texture. Let's look at the people. Let's look at everything that's there and not be distracted by color. It's super important.
Yeah, I think also we were trying to very directly react against, not that there's anything wrong with the glowy, beautiful, nice light portfolio image, but that's serving a particular function. And what we were trying to do is, in a way, kind of not react against that, but very distinctively position ourselves as something different from that. So I think the black and white helps immediately set this tone of a kind of more I don't know, analytical maybe, critical kind of perspective.
I've seen some of them in color though, and some of them are like, there's one of the metal bench at Michigan that is so sexy in color. But we use those sometimes in our marketing portfolio, but not when we're talking about ideas.
Hello, just a quick question. You talked a lot about, I guess, like this idea of prompts and limitations, and like prompting something for like diverse futures, but like prompts can also serve as kind of boundaries in a sense. So how do you navigate this, I guess, paradoxical boundary of creating something that is a boundary, but that also has like diverse pathways to other futures?
We could go really deep on that question. I mean, gosh. I don't know. Do you mean it in a super deep way?
Whatever way you want to talk about.
I got up at 5:30 this morning, so it might be hard to go there. But it's a really interesting paradox that you touch on there. Yeah, how do you inscribe something within the work that is yet to be flipped open, right? In some ways, there's a parallel conversation you can have, perhaps, between the precision with which we bring to the design and fabrication of a particular thing, and some of the forces and activities and dynamics that might be spawned from that. In some ways, we use what we anticipate to be measures and behaviors of people or systems or whatever they are, begin to think through how to inscribe those in the making of the object, whether it's a bench or a bigger landscape, right? But knowing that we have to do that in a way which allows not for a single body type, for instance, I'm going to talk about bodies and benches for a moment, but multiple body types, and to allow, in this sense, to anticipate that people may occupy them in certain ways that we can anticipate, and they may occupy them in ways that we cannot anticipate. And so I don't know where that line falls as we're developing it, right? How do you create that clear cut? But I think it has something to do with that question of precision and limitation. It also has something to do with the way in which we just simply ask people their own reactions to things within the common urban landscape, what seems accessible to them, what seems off-putting to them, and how is it that we might begin to, again, bring that into the work. I don't feel like I'm giving your question a fair go, though. Maybe we can have a drink later.
Any other?
Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions? I guess the kind of closing question that we have is, what are some of your most memorable, the most memorable moment from this book project? You shared your favorite, or one of your most memorable photos, but whether or not this is a collaboration, from the collaboration itself, or from the scene, or a particular event that happened while you're making it, and we'll make that as our last kind of prompt for the session.
Gosh, there was, I think Chris said this has been 5 years now, I think, in the making, and about 2 years of pretty solid shooting. And there's just so many amazing and profound moments. The process that I talked about earlier of kind of putting walls down and then just seeing seeing what fills that space, seeing how people enter into interactions if you go into them as open as you possibly can. And it's a difficult thing to do over and over again every day. There's definitely time. I'm more of an introvert myself, so there's definitely times when I had to just pull myself out of that hotel room and force myself to just walk down the street, because, you know, I would convince myself that I didn't have to go take pictures. I knew that I would, but the way to convince myself was that I said I did not have to take pictures. I just had to go walk. And what I would find is that every time I would do that and try to at least enter into that space of kind of openness and vulnerability, sometimes I wouldn't even have to be me initiating. In fact, there was one time in St. Louis, in North St. Louis, I was at a bar, or there was a bar that was open in the middle of the day. It was probably 1:30 or 2 p.m. And it was just this dark kind of saloon-style bar. But North St. Louis is almost, I mean, I don't know the demographics exactly, but it's pretty much all black neighborhood. And I felt that, you know, I felt very comfortable walking around and open, being in that space, but walking into this bar that was so clearly, it was like a historic bar. It was just dark. I couldn't even see inside of it. It's just this moment, and I've done this many times. In fact, it's like a kind of a thing that I do to get myself out of my comfort zone and just look for a moment to happen. And I do a lot of work in deep rural areas, and I'll just walk into tiny town bar, and it's that saloon moment, you know, where you walk in and everyone in there looks at you, and you're the one person there that everyone doesn't know. And I was psyching myself up to have that moment, but I was sitting on the sidewalk just trying to get myself to do that. And this guy was like peering out at me. He looks out and he just walks out and says, "You're old enough to drink, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah." He's like, "Well, come on in." And so he invited me in and just kind of scooped me up. And it was cash only. I was like, "I don't have any cash." He's like, "Let me drive you to the gas station, to the ATM." And it just, like, you know, took all of the possible potential tension right out of the air. And sometimes I can be that person that creates that, and other times it has to be someone else. But I'm grateful when other people do it.
There are many. Mike explored these cities in so many different ways than I did, and sometimes we did that together. I didn't know Mike. I mean, I feel like I know him. I feel every time he gets up and talks about the work, I see and hear something different, that I continue to learn from him. I mean, we've developed a great relationship in some ways. Like, I feel like you're an old friend at this point. He's been to my house. I still have to go. He has this great little house in the woods in Nashville. Rents one of them. It's hand-built. He built it at the same time that we were doing the project, so I could track that with him. We had a moment up in the gallery where the two of us saw the image of the women. We've seen some of those images at a scale that we've never seen them before. And the way we can enter into a conversation about things we hadn't seen before in those is really quite remarkable as well. So it's work that continues to kind of offer something new, and it's a relationship that